Without further ado, we'll move to our next presentation, and we'll take all the sort of questions and discussions I think belong sort of most appropriate at the end. So without further ado, over to you, Kurt.
Okay, well, thank you, Tim, and thank you, Peter. I'll pick up where Peter left off and probably fill in some blanks that are congruent with Peter's messaging. Bosnia-Herzegovina under the Dayton Agreement is a particular sort of captured state, owing to the incentives that were baked into the system, into the structure and the source code. It remains a system designed by warlord party leaders for warlord party leaders. And albeit it had external guardrails when it was agreed at the time. The presumption that attended its creation was that these party leaders were representing constituent people communities that Peter had mentioned, and that they would remain dominant. Now, while the former presumption is highly questionable, given what we've just heard and what I'll continue to tell you, and the recent local elections on November 15th demonstrate that there is popular will to deviate from that script. The latter fact, that the leading parties remain dominant in Dayton, Bosnia, is definitely true. And they maintain that dominance not only over the political space, but over the economic, including the illicit economic space, media, and public life more broadly. I call this sort of agglomeration of power that follows from internationally brokered power sharing agreements like the Dayton Agreement, these consociational power sharing agreements. I call them peace cartels. And my research originated with my experience in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I wanted to see if this applied further afield elsewhere. But I'm going to concentrate on Bosnia today because that's our topic. Politics remains a for-profit endeavor in Bosnia-Herzegovina. It was designed to be. That should not be a surprise. So Dayton and the Washington Agreement that preceded it, that created the Federation, vested powers in the middle layers of government. The entities, and in the Federation's case, the cantons. That's where the power is, that's where the money is. The state and the local governments, municipal governments, were retro-engineered. They existed, but their powers and competences, to the extent they exist, were built up in the first decade after Dayton. And the past 15 years, they've taken a beating. So in the first decade after the war, internationally led efforts through the enforcement mechanisms in the Dayton Peace Agreement, the High Representative, the large NATO-backed force, first implementation force I-4, then stabilization force S-4, now U-4, which is an EU-led force. But that first decade was when a lot of the state building went on. So a lot of the institutions that now exist in the country, Ministry of Security, Indirect Taxation Authority that operates the value-added tax, the Court of Bosnia-Herzegovina with its specialized chambers for organized crime and war crimes, all that was subsequent to Dayton, and almost all of it was agreed through inter-entity agreements between the two entities. Now, these were not imposed by the High Representative, who has the power to do that, but they would not have happened had there not been a High Representative with that power. So direct election of mayors started in 2004. What I'm trying to get at is the asymmetry of these entities accounts for a lot of the differences in coercive power and the way that they operate. The Republika Srpska, as Tim noted in his lead up, is a pyramid. It's an absolute monarchy. There's one godfather, and it's been Milorad Dodik since 2006. All the coercive instruments in the Republika Srpska answer to him. And while he is no longer formally the Republika Srpska's leader, he is definitely still the Republika Srpska's leader while he sits on the state presidency. So there's a singular target for an opposition to mobilize against. There's one guy. But so in that sense, it's positive, but he has a lot more coercive power, so it's a lot less forgiving environment to try to be active. The Federation is a hydra. It's a much more feudal system. And under its strictures, there is greater room to operate in the civic space, because nobody's completely cornered the market, though you can, at different local levels, you could question that. But generally, those two dominant parties, the SDA in the leading Bosniak party, and the Croatian Democratic Union, HDZ, the leading Croat party, are the two dominant players within that federation firmament. And whatever they can disagree about, it's usually about the divvying up of the spoils. But the political leaderships of these parties, SNSD and Republika Srpska, SDA, HDZ, and any of the adjunct parties that operate in coalition with them, all come together around, can we keep what we stole? Can we keep stealing? Can we remain unaccountable, both politically and legally? So in this composite state, any compromise that they make is usually at the popular expense. So the state government is a coalition of erstwhile adversaries, this peace cartel, and they determine the course of policy and practice of governance. Once one is a made man, and they're almost all men, and I'm adopting that mafia terminology advisedly, once one enters that realm, and all the dominant players in Bosnian politics are men at this point, it's effectively a lifetime gig. There's an inside-outside dynamic in the RS firmament. In the Federation, it's harder to define opposition because you have 10 cantons in the Federation, so you could usually find a place to land. But there's no major political contender that I can think of that is fundamentally advocating a change to the state's operating system. You will find complaints about Dayton, but you have not seen proposals for a fundamental change to the Dayton structure. Connor, if you could show the graph that I wanted to show, that chart, just very quickly to explain the dynamic to the public. I don't know if you can see it yet. Great. So the complex Dayton org chart that I'm showing here demonstrates the complex Dayton org chart that you will see of government entities, who heads what, so forth, and it looks like a complete rat's nest. That's not the real architecture of power. This is the real architecture of power that you're seeing. The political elites, yes, they're divided in many ways in that middle layer, but they have a common interest in maintaining what they have. They may fight over their relative shares, but they definitely don't want to give any of it up to their citizens. So they're able to operate both through leveraging fear against their citizens, and Peter mentioned this in a lot of detail of how this is done, for example, to returnee communities, but to anybody. If you work for any level of government, you're afraid your vote is not secret, and that's a legitimate fear, are you really going to vote against the architecture of power? Now, some people still will, but a large proportion of the population still sits elections out. Patronage, almost all public sector jobs, and the public sector is still very large, are patronage jobs. So being aligned or bribing your way into getting a gig is de rigueur. So that quite often is a package deal, but the fear goes upward too, toward the international community. We effectively have a pacification policy toward Bosnia, Herzegovina, and the region. It's not just containment. It's effective alliance for different ends with the political elites. We accept that they could, this is why it's a peace cartel, that they could end the peace when they want to end the peace. And therefore the patronage comes downward, basically to rent social peace for them for our own purposes. That's effectively the common EU Western policy that the United States still largely subscribes to, though complainingly. Thank you, Connor. You can unflip that screen now, and I'll move to the next graph momentarily. So note that both the levers of fear and patronage are essential tools for these made men. They're both absolutely vital for them. Now, moving on. This is where I'll show you where we're going momentarily. Here we go. So external actors effectively use Dayton's guardrails to pressure forward movement by political elites in that state building period, the first decade after the war. And we would not have gotten those state institutions without that forward movement and that pressure. But a certain presumption prevailed 15 years ago. That was that the international community's offer of Euro-Atlantic enlargement for Dayton's political elites, for the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina, would be enough to impel forward movement. That because there was an open door to the EU and NATO, that would be enough for Bosnia's political elites to propel themselves to adopt the reforms, to adopt legislation, adopt the acquis communautaire. That didn't happen, but as we can see over the past decade and a half. But this was a very common presumption, including by my former boss, Paddy Ashdown. When I worked at OHR, he would talk about the push of Dayton being replaced by the pull of Brussels. What we've seen instead is that the peace cartel is effectively free range. They have no controlling authority. We were the only control that exerted leverage on them. And since we lifted that, since it became a theological point for the European Union to not have an effective international high representative or a potent international deterrent force that they controlled under EUFOR, they're still there. Legally, they're still valid. Practically, they've been allowed to wither over the past decade and a half. So in the intervening decade and a half, there's been capture of the complete governmental structure by the peace cartel, including the judiciary, as Peter mentioned, but across the board. So there effectively are no rules. And so this regression has been going on ever since 2016. So while these structures still exist, the European Union was unable to convince other members of the Peace Implementation Council. This was the international structure that oversees implementation of the Dayton Peace Agreement. They were unable to convince them to close the Office of the High Representative. So it's still there, and it's supposed to be closed according to a formula called 5+2 that includes a basket of conditions and criteria. I think with the exception of the amendment to the Bosnian Constitution to accept Brčko as having access to the Constitutional Court, none of those have been met. So we've seen this regression from which, when the European Union began, it was referred to itself as the only game in town, very, very self-confident after the 2004 enlargement. Now we're effectively still operating on that same policy presumption, despite the fact we have 15 years of demonstrated proof that the Bosnian political elites have made a cost-benefit analysis that nothing the EU can offer them is better than what they've already got. So they won't give any of that up. So there is no inducement that will change that analysis. But there's an unwillingness to confront that, and this is where I think I'm hoping that we have, with the change in the administration in the United States. Bosnia was not unscathed by the Trump era, but it certainly didn't take the hit or get the attention of Serbia and Kosovo. But by opening up the idea of borders not being sacrosanct, which had previously been a bipartisan shibboleth, a totem, that opened up even further the whet appetites of every unfulfilled agenda in the Balkans. So now you have geopolitical contestation in a way that we had not seen. We have the Russians moved on to being an aggressive disruptor after the inducement of war in Ukraine in 2014. China is, as part of its Belt and Road Initiative and its efforts to connect itself to the European Union and have states that are supportive of it within the EU and that will join the EU, They are much more active in Bosnia and the rest of the Western Balkans. We have a lot of geopolitical angst in the European Union and the United States about that. But unfortunately, the standpoint that we're taking is one of allowing ourselves to be arbitraged by the existing political elites rather than using the leverage we have. So in my closing, and I'm going to wrap up now so Sonata can begin. So in the last 3 or 4 minutes, I wanted to say we do have a great deal of leverage in this system, should we choose to apply it. Connor, if you could show the second screen, the second chart. Thank you very much. So America's greatest value added with, in the United States is to act and catalyze a confrontation with reality that has not happened thus far among the international guarantors of the Dayton Peace Agreement. We need to be honest with ourselves about what we can do and what we can't do. We can't fix Bosnia, but we can make it a lot easier for those Bosnians who do want to fix Bosnia and Herzegovina to get traction. So I'm hoping that this is something that in rebooting transatlanticism after 4 years of an aggressive beatdown and effectively the second non-Atlanticist administration in a row, and I think there's a chance that Biden instinctively is more Atlanticist than any president we will have had since Bush 41. To reboot that and see this as an area where we could collaborate in trying to come up with an organic solution that works for Bosnia and Herzegovina's citizens. So first step is to limit the amount of space the peace cartel has to maneuver. You see that coordination between external actors and citizens mobilized for change. Now they have to mobilize for change, and without that, we don't have a partner in that regard, but we can make it a more conducive environment. So limiting the ability to leverage fear by reinforcing the enforcement mechanisms of both EUFOR, and this is why I've proposed having troops in Perpetual to take the secession story off the talking points of Milorad Dodik. But also another element, and Peter alluded to this or directly confronted it, safe and secure environment also means not having the coercive forces of your own government, your own people squeezing you. This is what happened in Banja Luka at the end of 2018 with the end of the Justice for David protests. So to adopt Slobodan Milosevic's line, nobody should dare to beat you, which is the one line that launched his career, that should be the line we should have too, that as long as people are peacefully protesting, they should not fear being coercively squeezed by and attacked by their government. And that's something that fits in with our Annex 1A mandate of EUFOR. So EUFOR should be configured to be able to deter that as well. And then you can cut off the money. That's the patronage side. We're buying social peace for the political elites. We should cease to do so. So we can instill fear in the political elites, limit their room to maneuver, and force them to confront the change that their citizens want if they manifest that change. We can't make that happen, but we could be far better suited to doing it, and state very clearly that we need to see a constitutional order to replace Dayton, not just reform Dayton, not just adjust Dayton, but replace Dayton with something that is popularly legitimate for the first time. So I think that's my 20 minutes almost exactly, and now I'll shut up. But thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.